On April 15, the Ninth Army was again subjected to persistent attacks east of Berlin. On both sides of the Kustrin-Berlin highway, the Russians employed a considerable number of troops, especially artillery. Compared to the previous days, the activity of Soviet aviation, especially on the front line of the German defense, increased markedly. The general tension of both the offensive and the defensive reached its highest point. I, who had fought on various fronts for many years, was familiar with this state, when a soldier lying flat under hurricane fire feels an irresistible desire to jump to his feet and run away from this hell. But party and government high-ranking officials preferred not to think about all this. In those dramatic days, radio broadcasts, newspaper articles, official speeches, and private conversations of the top leaders of the German state were dominated by one topic: the death of the U.S. President on April 12, 1945. Although there was absolutely no reason to expect that this event would have any effect on the overall political situation, Propaganda Minister Goebbels nevertheless loudly proclaimed Roosevelt's death a miracle, an important turning point in the fate of Germany. In support of this claim, he again used the usual propaganda rhetoric, comparing the death of the American president to the sudden death of the Russian Empress Elizabeth during the 7 Years' War, a death that saved Prussia from imminent defeat. Goebbels persistently persuaded the exhausted German people that America's alliance with the Soviet Union would now inevitably dissolve, and the war would surely end with the victory of the Third Reich. But on April 16 came the long-awaited release of inhuman tension, fully exposed, and the soldiers on the front line, and the German population in the rear, all the lies of Goebbelsov's Goy propaganda associated with the death of Roosevelt. Still, night darkness covered the ground when thousands of artillery guns of the Russians opened frantic fire on the locations of the 9th Panzer Army and the 4th Tank Army. Something unimaginable was going on. It felt as if an invisible hand raised the curtain of the last act of the greatest tragedy that humanity has ever experienced. The Russian batteries stood in dense rows, literally touching the wheels of the guns. The artillery preparation continued for several hours. Then the Russian regiments, divisions, and armies moved forward. The attack on the 4th Panzer Army, occupying positions between Moscow and Forst, began at 7:30 a.m., and on the 9th Army, defending the frontiers on the Oder, an hour earlier. In the Führer's orders sent that day to the troops on the Eastern Front, again mentioned the death of Roosevelt. Hitler once again assured the soldiers that the death of the American president will certainly change the entire course of events in their favor, that Berlin will remain the capital of Germany, and Vienna will once again become a German city. Meanwhile, a feverish movement began in the streets of Berlin, a continuous muffled rumbling from afar, in which individual ruptures were not yet distinguishable, drove the Berliners out of their apartments and cellars at these early hours. Bunches of newly conscripted Volkssturmists were hurrying to the muster stations. At noon, the 1st Militia Unit had already left by commuter train for its assigned positions. In and around Berlin, solid anti-tank barriers had been erected, leaving only narrow passages. Frightened women and children huddled together, fearfully listening to the distant thunder of the military storm. One thought troubled Evering: would the Russians capture their city first, or would they be able to hold out until the arrival of the Americans, who had already crossed the Elbe? This question was clearly marked on the tired, anxious faces of the people who were walking through the streets and standing in lines outside the grocery stores. The panic that reigned everywhere was caused by the news of the atrocities committed by the Red Army among the civilian population, about which all the German media trumpeted incessantly. Only the hope for the imminent arrival of the Americans allowed to maintain some semblance of order, not to lose their heads completely. And they had to come first, they just had to. I was in the reception room of General Krebs's office in Tussen, and urgent telephone calls followed in a continuous succession. Often all 3 telephones on my desk rang at once, but then General Krebs called, and I proceeded to his office through the double soundproof doors. He stood bent over the maps, spread out on the desk, marked with red and blue lines indicating the locations of our and Soviet troops on the Oder. The general was so absorbed in his obviously unhappy thoughts that I had to cautiously cough to remind him of my presence. Only then did he slowly straighten up and look at me for a while with an absent look. Then, "I wanted to ask you to put me in touch with General Bergdorf again. I need, after all, to know firmly where our command post is supposed to be relocated. Try to find out in Berchtesgaden and send Major Freitag to me. Oh, and one more thing, bring me a glass of vermouth, please." Turning to the reception room, I telephoned Berchtesgaden and the Imperial Chancellery, then went in search of Major von Freitag Loringhofen. It was he who informed me that the Russian artillery had begun an intensive bombardment of our positions near Kustrin at 3:50, and that 3 hours later the enemy's troops were on the offensive. At the time of the conversation, the hands of the clock were already showing almost 10 o'clock in the morning. In the last hour, the reports from the front began to come less frequently. The Russian artillery fire, obviously, seriously disrupted line communication. I could not help thinking of my comrades who were there in the hell. By that time, the battle was about to reach its climax. How often I myself had to find myself in the most difficult situation. How many times I lay buried in the ground in the vast Russian expanses, praying to God that death had bypassed me. Only a soldier knows how sad a wounded man is when there is a brutal battle around, and how relieved he feels when his comrades pick him up and carry him out of the shelling to safety. All young staff officers were eager to be at the front, to participate in the battle. Forced passivity, despite the complete futility of further resistance, was very depressing, a heavy burden pressed on the psyche. This state of mind cannot be understood by anyone who has never been concerned with the fate of his fatherland. I and Major von Freitag Loringhofen stood silent and listened for several minutes, each immersed in his own sorrowful thoughts, but thinking the same thing. The Major, a cheerful and trim officer, looked extremely tired and sad, for we had been working hard lately, day after day, without rest, sometimes until morning. Without saying a word, he got up, glanced at me briefly, and went into General Krebs's office. I took a bottle of vermouth out of the safe and poured a glass. A short time later, after the air raid alarm had sounded, 5 Soviet attack planes swiftly flew over our heads. It was a wonder to us. Usually until then, Russian planes very rarely ventured deeper into enemy territory than 20 kilometers from the front line, unless they were sure of the absence of German fighters. The telephones kept ringing without ceasing. Each time there was only one question: is there any news? At 11 a.m., in the reception room piled generals and colonels. Exactly at 11:00 a.m., was to hold a meeting in the office of the Chief of General Staff of the Army, General Krebs. This day, waiting for the invitation more lively than usual, exchanged views. Where should the Army headquarters be evacuated, and what preparatory measures were necessary for this? Also discussed was the still existing possibility of reaching Berchtesgaden through Bohemia, which, however, according to most of those present, will soon be irretrievably lost. Hitler still had not decided to which place to move his headquarters along with the auxiliary services. Soon called a non-commissioned officer of our advance group, left a few days ago by train to Berchtesgaden. Krebs's wife and daughter had also gone with this group, and I questioned the non-commissioned officer about everything that I thought would interest the general. At the end of the conversation came the question, what will happen to us? How was I to know? No man in all Germany had the slightest idea of what lay ahead of us. Around noon, the first more or less intelligible report came from the front. The attacks have been repulsed. In some areas the battle continues. Our losses are extremely high. These were familiar formulations which we had heard so often at Leningrad and Volkhov, at Lake Ilmen, in the Pripyat marshes, and at Warsaw. Afternoon, exactly at 4 p.m., the Russian artillery resumed its bombardment, lasting, as before, an hour and a half, and then they went on the attack, wave after wave. The evening report said positions still held, holding back the enemy from deeper penetration, send reinforcements and ammunition. The Russians managed to cut into our positions in several places south and north of Frankfurt. They advanced even further west of Kustrin, on both sides of the Kustrin-Berlin highway, and approached the Zilo defense line. About 10 p.m. Krebs and Major von Frittedy, who had accompanied him that day, returned from another working meeting in the Imperial Chancellery. I had already ordered that dinner be prepared for them, and that everything be put on the table so that they could eat before they began their work, which I knew would not end until 3 or 4 o'clock at night, and might last until the morning, over a cup of coffee. The Major told me that tonight we will have to leave the positions west of Kustrin. The main line of defense has been moved to the Zilo Heights, but there's no hope. Maybe we can hold the Zilo line, but not for more than 24 hours. The situation in the west is no better. In the north, the British are approaching Lüneburg. The Americans have crossed the Elbe between Magdeburg and Dessau. They are nearer Berlin than the Russians. In Saxony, they are approaching Halle and Leipzig, and in the south, the Americans have entered Bavaria. The Russians hold positions in the Brunn area and west of Vienna. At Lausitz, the Russians, attacking the 4th Tank Army between Muskau and Forst, on the first day succeeded in effecting a break through our defensive lines, and although further advance is suspended, it is doubtful whether our units can withstand the incessant attack. Our forces are depleted, and there are almost no reserves left. The Major was silent, staring into space, probably thinking of his wife and child, who lived near Leipzig, and then continued. And another thing. As we drove through Berlin Tempelhof in the evening, crowds of assembled people shouted at us, "Bloodsuckers! All bloodsuckers!" The Major fell silent, then sat down at his desk and began going through the day's mail. The next day, April 17, the battle for Berlin and in the Lausitz area continued with unrelenting fierceness. Under the onslaught of superior forces, German divisions, step by step, slowly retreated. As in the evening report of the 4th Tank Army said, basically our positions we defended. Aviation helped by making more than 1,000 airplane sorties. As a result of the counterattack undertaken along the highway Kustrin, Berlin by the 9th Army, we managed to stop the enemy. Battles were fought in the areas of penetration of enemy units deep into the German defences. The left flank corps of this army successfully repulsed the Russian attacks and held their positions. On April 18, with wonderful spring weather, fighting resumed with redoubled vigour. The Russians persistently attacked, bypassing Berlin from the south. With no less fierceness, both sides fought in Silesia and in the wooded area around Lausitz, where the numerical superiority of the Red Army was especially felt. At about 9 a.m., it was still fortunate to be able to contact my wife in Lübeck by telephone. Not having full knowledge of the true scale of the disaster that had unfolded, she was nevertheless extremely alarmed and frightened. Everyone says that the Russians are already on the outskirts of Berlin. I heard my wife's worried voice. "I am so afraid for you. Can you hear me? Can't you come here to us? What will happen to all of us? Are people right in saying that the English are already at Lüneburg?" Before I could answer, the connection was cut off. It was our last conversation with my wife. 4 weeks later, she was informed that I died in Berlin. And the first decisive breakthrough Russians carried out on April 90. A small advanced detachment of tanks moved from the site of the main battle, raging near the towns of Forst and Guben, Forst-Spree near Spremberg. The German troops had abandoned Forst. The Russians clearly aimed not at Prague, as Hitler constantly claimed, but at Berlin from the rear, in full accordance with the predictions of the German General Staff. Our units occupying positions between Forst and Fürstenberg were thrown far back. The fighting east of Berlin continued with unrelenting vigour. The Russians advanced on Jansfield and Müncheberg and occupied Vritzen. North of Bucha, 150 enemy tanks broke through to our rear. On the Oder, the 9th Army managed to maintain its lines only in the suburbs of Frankfurt. By the evening of April 19, it became clear that the Russians intend to encircle Berlin, and the 9th Army counter-strikes from the north and south. On that day, Goebbels read over the radio an address to the German people, which the next morning, on the Führer's birthday, was published in the newspapers still in circulation, among other things. It repeated Hitler's earlier promise that Berlin would remain German and Vienna would certainly be a German city again. And what is surprising, even now, on the brink of the abyss, many Germans piously believed Hitler's words. Years of treatment by the sophisticated Goebbels propaganda machine had borne its fruit, and they did not stop trusting in the notorious secret weapon, which supposedly should be activated in the coming days or even hours. Besides, did Goebbels not assure that the Americans and Russians would soon fight each other? The skillfully initiated rumor campaign was not without success in convincing the German soldiers defending Berlin of the imminent alliance of the Americans with them to fight Bolshevik Russia together. On Goebbels' orders, leaflets were scattered over Berlin claiming, "Army units and tanks are already coming to our aid." This also gave hope to the civilian population and soldiers at the front, encouraging them to hold on with their last strength. Obviously, the authors of the leaflets were referring to the 12th Army under the command of General Wenck, too weak to really influence the situation. Most of its divisions existed only on paper. More or less staffed were only 3 divisions, organized into a corps led by Cavalry General Kohler. 3 weeks ago, Kohler, who had come to the General Staff for an official presentation after his return from Norway, told me that he had just learned that his only son had been killed in action. According to Kohler, his divisions were poorly equipped and armed. About 90% of the personnel had no combat experience at all. Most were 17 to 18-year-olds from work teams and military schools, and only half were armed. And this army, according to Hitler, was to save Germany, to ensure her victory. Announcing Wenck on his appointment as commander of the 12th Army, Hitler said, with pathos, "Wenck, I entrust you with the fate of Germany." In ordering the formation of this army, Hitler planned to use it against the Anglo-American allies. According to his initial instructions, Wenck should, moving from the area east of the Harz mountain range, to connect with Army Group B blocked in the Ruhr enclave. Then, when events began to develop faster than expected, and the Allies surrounded in the Harz 11th Army, Wenck was ordered to break through to her. At that point, to rush to the rescue of Army Group was no longer any sense. The whole question was how many more days it will be able to hold the Ruhr enclave. April 20, on the day of Hitler's 56th birthday, the Russians developed an offensive from the area of Lausitz to the northwest, and by evening had already reached Spreewald. At this time, General Krebs sent a well-armed motorized detachment of 250 men, the last combat reserve of the Chief of the General Staff of the Army personally, to meet the enemy near Luckau, 40 kilometers south of our headquarters. Soon came even sadder news. Russian troops concentrated north of Berlin, passing through Eberswalde, reached Oranienburg. This offensive had actually begun the day before, but was mentioned in the report only as a breakthrough in a separate section of 150 tanks of the enemy. In reality, it was a decisive strike by an entire tank corps, carried out on the orders of Marshal Zhukov in the Imperial Chancellery. Meanwhile, the celebrations for the Führer's birthday continued. The celebration was attended by almost all of Hitler's old associates. Among those present could be seen Goering, Himmler, Bormann, Speer, and the leaders of the 3 branches of the army. At first everything was calm, but soon the closest associates of the Führer began to demand that he, along with his headquarters, to leave Berlin and move to Upper Bavaria. Did not persuade him only Goebbels, Gauleiter and High Commissar of Defense of Berlin, but Hitler hesitated. So far, he agreed only to Grand Admiral Dönitz to become the ruler of the northern part of Germany, in case the Americans and Russians agreed to split the Third Reich in 2. Since he did not name the ruler of the southern part of the divided state, we could rightly assume that he has not yet given up the idea of moving south. Himmler and his staff and the Foreign Office would move to the territory controlled by Dönitz, and Goering was to follow to the south, to stay in Berlin, as Hitler repeatedly emphasized, motivated by his fanatical belief in his own genius and invulnerability. He was, moreover, firmly convinced that his personal presence in the capital will inspire soldiers to heroic feats that will help to stop and destroy the advancing Russian hordes. At noon, Hitler personally presented the Iron Crosses to teenagers from the Hitler Youth who had shown courage and bravery. Only in the evening, when the guests left the Imperial Chancellery, the Führer was introduced to the exceptionally alarming reports of the front units, as discussed above. They refer to the advance of the Red Army from the Moscow forced area in a northwesterly direction and the breakthrough of Russian tanks, previously stationed north of Berlin, to Oranienburg. These last events meant the inevitable catastrophe of Germany, for they indicated the intention of the Soviet command to take Berlin in pincers. On top of everything, the Russians launched an attack on the positions of the 3rd German Panzer Army. In the evening, the troops of Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky captured 2 bridgeheads on the western side of the Oder, south of Stettin, where the river spilled into the width of 3 kilometers. At the same war council, Hitler was informed that General Steiner transferred his army group to the open southern flank of the 3rd Panzer Army. In reality, however, this message was a complete fiction. Steiner, in fact, received such an order from the command of Army Group Vistula, but he did not have the troops to fulfill it. The plan was to form this army group from the remnants of broken German military units, in disarray retreating from the front line, as well as to include 1 or 2 combat formations from Army Group Vistula. However, all these plans remained on paper, and to realize them in the ensuing chaos was not possible. Hitler ordered Steiner within 24 hours to attack the Russian troops that broke through north of Berlin, cut them off from the main forces and destroy them. In his calculations, the Oder was still the basis of the defensive lines in the east. Separate units of the 9th Army, still in Frankfurt on Oder, were to organize an offensive in the southern direction, and together with parts of Army Group Center, under the command of Field Marshal General Schorner, to repel the troops of Marshal Konev, advanced to the Neisse River. From the remaining far behind the rear supply bases, it was assumed that as a result of joint decisive actions of the Army Group Steiner, parts of the 9th Army and individual compounds Schorner Red Army will be defeated. In reality, Hitler did not know, nor did he wish to know, what was really going on outside the Imperial Chancellery. When the Council of War on that venerable April 20 ended and night fell, the great exodus from Berlin began. Himmler and his staff went north. Goering and his Air Force General Staff, with the exception of Generals Kohler and Christensen, who had been delayed, went south. With them went also the bulk of the party and government officials. The next morning, at 6 o'clock, I was awakened by a telephone call from Senior Lieutenant Krenkel, the head of the detachment sent the day before on a reconnaissance mission. About 40 Russian tanks and motorized infantry passed us by, he reported. In our I'm going to attack, we immediately realized. Our command post is doomed. We had no reserves left at all. Wenck's army, which might have saved the situation, was fighting on the LB with the Americans. At 9 o'clock, Krenkel called again and said our attack was repulsed with heavy losses. Sent in the reconnaissance tanks reported the advance to the north of large tank columns of the Russians. It was not difficult to get. They were going to Berlin and on the way will certainly capture Zossen. I passed all these alarming reports to General Krebs, who immediately informed the Imperial Chancellery, insisting on the decision to relocate the General Staff because otherwise, they say, it will be impossible to reliably lead the troops. However, Hitler still procrastinated. April 22. Bad news fell like a cornucopia from both the northern and southern fronts and spread lightning fast through the corridors and rooms of our headquarters. I didn't have time to hang up the telephone. Everyone wanted to know whether General Krebs would have another meeting, given the bad news, and I inevitably answered that it would take place, as usual, at Elan 0, but immediately, in violation of my superior's orders, advised to be prepared for a hasty evacuation just in case. The meeting had not yet begun, but the reception room was already in an unceasing uproar and clamour. Communication officers, supply officers, secretaries were scurrying back and forth. The assembled generals and colonels were talking so loudly that I had to ask them several times to be quieter and not to interfere with my receiving telephonograms. But a few minutes before the meeting began, there was a sudden dead silence in the room. And at once there came again the deafening, jerky blows familiar to anyone who had ever been in battle. We looked at each other in silence, and on the faces of most of those present there was an expression of amazement rather than fear. "Those must be Russian tanks in Beirut," someone said. "Not more than 10 or 15 kilometers from here, I think. They could be here in half an hour." "Please, gentlemen," said General Krebs, appearing in the doorway of his office. Thus began the last meeting of the Chief of General Staff of the Army. But in a few minutes I was called to the reception room, where there was just arrived from the front Senior Lieutenant Krenkiel, extremely tired and dirty in the mud. He reported that there were only 30-40 men and a couple of cars left of his reinforced reconnaissance detachment. He said the Russians had taken Beirut, but a group of about 50 soldiers and Volkssturmists with 2 anti-aircraft guns were still resisting. The enemy advance had slowed. Having finished reporting, Krenkel asked what further instructions would be given. "Keep your men and vehicles ready for action," I ordered, and, returning to the consulting room, reported to the general the situation. Krebs immediately contacted the Führer by telephone to obtain permission to move our headquarters, but Hitler again replied with a refusal. Looking at the faces of the participants in the meeting, it was easy to guess that they were all thinking about their fate, soon to find themselves in a Soviet prisoner of war camp. A short time later a telephone call came from Burgdorf, who relayed Hitler's order. All troops fighting on both sides of the Elbe between Dresden and Dessau-Rosslau, with the onset of darkness, to withdraw to Berlin, making room for an unimpeded meeting of the Americans and Russians. But as has often happened in this war, the Russians behaved quite differently than we expected them to. Despite the absence of German military units in the southern direction, their tanks did not move from the spot and continued to threaten Berlin, being about 15 kilometers from our headquarters. Finally, at 13.0, we received Hitler's orders to move to Potsdam Eich and occupy the former Air Force barracks. At the same time, it was reported that the meeting in the Imperial Chancellery will be held at 14:30. It was urgent to prepare for the redeployment. Having switched off the telephone, I passed the entrance gate of the Maybach complex at exactly 14.0, and with a convoy of vehicles of the Administrative Department of the General Staff, set a course for Potsdam. General Krebs and his adjutant had left 15 minutes earlier. Hundreds of thousands of people on wagons, bicycles, but most of them on foot, with handcarts and baby carriages, were moving along the highway in an endless line, all heading west somewhere, just to get away from the enemy troops. Everywhere, on city and village outposts, our tanks occupied combat positions. On hastily erected artificial fences and barricades played children who had not yet truly realized the tragedy of the impending mortal danger. With paper helmets on their heads and wooden swords in their hands, they waved cheerfully, wishing us a good journey. We struggled through the dense stream of refugees as we made our way to Potsdam. A passing motorcyclist told us that Russian artillery was already shelling the central part of Berlin, and that there were already the first civilian casualties on Dorotheastrasse. At that moment, the last meeting with the Führer was in progress in the Imperial Chancellery. Unfortunately, I did not have the opportunity to attend it. I had to supervise the transportation of headquarters equipment. However, as soon as von Freytag-Loringhofen and General Krebs returned to the headquarters, they informed me of the progress of the meeting. For the last time, Hitler gathered in his vast office all military, party and state leaders who were still in the capital of the Third Reich or somewhere nearby. And the meeting began on April 22, as usual, with the report of Jodial and Krebs. Hitler listened rather indifferently, and only when Krebs talked about military operations in the territory between the Sudetenland and Stettin visibly revived and began to show interest. According to Krebs, by that time the Russians southwest of Berlin had reached the boundaries east of the line Troyen-Britzen, Belitzi-Teltow. To the north of the capital, the fighting unfolded on the approaches to Lichtenberg, Niederschönhausen and Freudenberg. Enemy tanks were already spotted at Prenzlau-Airoli. In the course of the desperate attacks undertaken, the enemy occupied Oranienburg. This meant that in a day, or at most 2 days, Berlin will be in a tight ring of enemy troops. At this point, Hitler interrupted the speaker and asked, "Where is SA General Steiner with his army group?" The fact is that back on April 20, the Führer ordered a powerful flank strike on the enemy troops advancing on Oranienburg. After a brief pause, Hitler explained that the flank attack did not take place, and that only because of the transfer of the most capable units defending Berlin. To help Steiner, Russian managed to overcome the weakened defences to the north and northeast of the capital and reach the outer outskirts of Berlin. Here Hitler could not stand it and ordered everyone except Keitel, Krebs, Jodl, Bergdorf and Bormann to leave the room. In the room for some time reigned tense and threatening silence. But then, as if under the influence of an unknown force, Hitler jumped to his feet and burst into a furious rage. His face alternately turned pale and purple, and he was shaking like a fever, hoarsely shouting treason, cowardice, insubordination. As in previous unbridled explosions of rage, Hitler blamed all the troubles and failures of the armed forces and SS troops. In the end, he categorically stated that he refused to leave the city, stayed with the Berliners and will personally lead the battle. Then present witnesses of this incredible scene saw Hitler suddenly became silent and sank into a chair completely exhausted. The contrast with the preceding fit was striking. Bent in the seat, the Führer sobbed like a little child and for the first time, without excuses, openly admitted his defeat. "It's over," he said. "The war is lost. I must shoot myself." Almost 5 minutes gathered in the deliberation room, not knowing what to do, remained silent. The first to break it was Jodl, speaking calmly but firmly and carefully choosing words. He reminded Hitler of his duty to the German people and the armed. Others also tried to reassure the Führer, to instill a new hope, reminding him of the vast German territories in the north and south of Germany, which are still steadfastly loyal to their duty troops. But even now, despite the insistent requests of his closest associates and colleagues immediately leave for Berchtesgaden, and from there to lead further military operations, Hitler was unwavering in his decision to remain in Berlin. He later confirmed that all civil and military authority in the northern German states was transferred to Grand Admiral Dönitz. Keitel and Jodl were to be in charge of the troops fighting in southern Germany, Austria, Bohemia, Croatia, and northern Italy, while in Berchtesgaden, although it turned out to be virtually impossible to do so, the announcement of Göring's transfer of authority over southern Germany was vague and very vague. The Führer also suggested that Goebbels moved with his wife and children to a shelter under the Imperial Chancellery and issued a proclamation to the people of Berlin, announcing that Hitler was still with them, personally directing the defense of the city and ready to share with the Berliners their fate. He also ordered that Bormann, who, contrary to orders, left Berlin, Bergdorf, Krebs and liaison officers to stay with him at all times in the shelter. The decisions taken at the last meeting were immediately transmitted by telephone or through the liaison officers to the respective military commanders to the troops. It is true that in connection with these decisions, as subsequent events showed, there were some inconsistencies in the delineation of competence between Göring and Himmler. Keitel and Jodl, who refused to leave Hitler, did not depart, as planned, immediately to the south, but solemnly promised the Führer to do everything in their power to protect, and, if necessary, the liberation of Berlin. That same night, Keitel went to General Wenck, commander of the 12th Army, and Jodl EU. First to General Steiner, then in Krampnitz, where the headquarters of the Supreme Command of the Land Forces, to direct the actions of primarily the 5th General Army. At the same time, on Hitler's orders, his personal physician Professor Morell, Admiral von Puttkamer, Adjutant Julius Schraub and other persons who performed secondary and auxiliary functions in Hitler's headquarters left Berlin. When Hitler's closest associates finally recovered from the shock caused by his violent reaction at the last meeting, they managed to a certain extent to cheer him up, give him some confidence and hope. Stay in Berlin tried to stay in the first place Keitel, Jodl and Bormann, and, of course, Goebbels, doomed by virtue of his official duties. Keitel and Jodl colourfully described the favourable opportunities that opened up before Germany as a result of the combined offensive of the 9th and 12th Armies, supported by attacks of troops Steiner and Holst. Jodl also suggested that all military units opposing the Western Allies be withdrawn and used in the Battle of Berlin. Goebbels and Bormann reminded Hitler of the actual colossal potential power that Berlin had if all its inhabitants capable of bearing arms were put under arms. All this, together with telephone calls from Hitler's supporters, who had learned from his liaison officers that he was having a nervous fit, helped to cheer him up for the final act of Germany's tragedy. As a result, the following orders and instructions followed one after another in the afternoon. 1. The 9th Army, which is still fighting fierce battles in the Frankfurt area and still holds some positions on the Oder, should make its way in a westerly direction, aiming to unite with Wenck's army. 2. Field Marshal General Keitel should immediately go to Wenck's army, assess the situation on the spot and personally give the order to unite with the 9th Army and withdraw from the American front. Then he should prepare a strike in the direction of Furch, southwest of Potsdam, in order to unblock Berlin. 3. Jodl with the forces of Steiner's army to organize an offensive on Berlin from the area north of Oranienburg. 4. Grand Admiral Dönitz was instructed to stop all other military operations and focus on the defense of Berlin. 5. Goebbels, as High Commissioner for the Defense of Berlin, is authorized to mobilize any internal forces and means for the needs of the defense of the city. Following from Zossen to Berlin with a convoy, I had to delay on the way to wait for the lagging vehicles to pull up. 2 German airplanes flew low over our heads, heading eastward. From afar, like the deafening rumblings of spring thunder, came the continuous, unmuted rumble of a gigantic battle. Near the Potsdam railroad station we passed about 20 or 30 unexploded bombs left after the last air raid. At the bridges near the Potsdam Palace we were forced to delay. Our way was blocked by thousands of cars piled up at the anti-tank barriers. I got out of the car and tried to establish some order among the huge crowd of excited drivers, ordinary people with carts and handcarts, mothers with children in their arms wrapped in blankets, all terribly frightened and confused. Before our eyes, sappers hastily mined both bridges, using explosives and unexploded aerial bombs. Eventually we did make our way into the city. From there we followed side streets. Most of the main thoroughfares were cluttered with the remains of destroyed houses and mottled with bomb craters. The bells of the former garrison church of Potsdam, where Hitler had once proclaimed the formation of the Third Reich and took the oath of office, lay among the debris and charred wooden structures. The empty eye sockets of the burned-out church gazed at us sorrowfully. When we arrived at our destination, the barracks in Potsdam HV, we were met by the headquarters staff, who had left Zossen before us, and a whole host of errands sprinkled from all sides. At 8 p.m., when the most urgent matters were finished, Major von Freytag-Loringhofen returned from the Imperial Chancellery, completely exhausted, and we sat down with him for a little rest and to talk about the events of the past day. Everything in the new headquarters was organized in a hurry. We knew that we would not stay here long. What would happen to both of us now that General Krebs was determined to stay in the capital, we did not know. Early the next day, early in the morning, rumors spread that headquarters was to be moved to Rheinsberg, and from there, in all probability, to Lübeck. I was simply afraid to believe in such a possibility and did not dare to even hope to see my wife and child in a few days. Soon I received new assignments from General Detlefsen, responsible for the defense of the headquarters of the General Headquarters of the Army. I had not yet had time to get to work when General Krebs called from the Imperial Chancellery and ordered Major von Freytag-Loringhofen to report to him immediately with everything necessary to stay in the Führer's underground shelter for several days. We both understood perfectly well what this meant, and the farewell was not easy for us. According to General Detlefsen's instructions, I gathered everyone I could into a combat unit, sent armoured personnel carriers on reconnaissance, and set up secure barriers in Gelto, Werder, and Marcourt to the west, north, and southwest of Potsdam, where the flow of refugees was increasing hour by hour. The roads outside the towns presented a strange sight. For the first time in the crowds of fleeing civilians, men in uniform began to appear, first one or two, then in small groups, then in multitudes. Some of them seemed to be aiming for a specific purpose, knowing who they were going to and why, but most of them were idly wandering wherever they were going. They had recently been in the gigantic meat grinder of the Eastern Front and were in a state of complete apathy. This was evident in the way they shifted their feet, reflected in their gazes. There were many wounded, hastily bandaged men of all ages among them. At 1700 hours I was summoned to see General Detolfsen. When I entered, the general, tall and extremely fatigued, rose and, giving me his hand on my shoulder and looking at me intently, he added, "When the decisive moment arrives and all these swarms rush away, try to get out of the hole in time and die, as befits a soldier, with dignity on Wilhelmplatz." He said the final phrase slowly and heartily, as if a father instructing his son. At the end he asked, "Is there anything else I can do for you?" There was a short silence in the room. Then, after giving the general my wife's address, I said goodbye and went out. It was not until I was in the semi-darkness of the long barracks corridor that I fully realized the terrible meaning of the general's words. All the preceding days and weeks I was in the thick of things, in the center of feverish activity, and reacted to what was going on around me in the same way as others did during all the years of war at the front. We did not think about the causes and did not look far into the future. We simply had no time for distracted reflection. I will not deny that in the first weeks and months of my work in the General Staff of the Land Forces, I was clearly aware that Germany would soon be completely defeated. But even then it was not perceived so directly close as at this moment. What a cruel awakening! I hurriedly packed my few belongings, said goodbye to my fellow soldiers, and left for my new place of further stay. I did not take my faithful orderly, Gummersbach, with me, for he was to deliver my last message to my wife. My way lay bypassing Potsdam through Nedlitz, Krampnitz, and Hirstrasse. It was no longer possible to pass directly through Wannsee and Dahlem. It was rumoured that the Russians had already cut this road at Zehlendorf. It was dusk, the streets were empty, and the hum of the battle for Berlin had almost died down. Driving along the wide avenue leading from east to west, we met not a soul, only the occasional shadow of a man running from one cellar to another. The closer we got to the centre, the more lifeless the giant city seemed. At last we reached Wilhelmplatz safely and without adventure and turned off onto Vossstrasse. Against the clear night sky, the dark, massive building of the Imperial Chancellery loomed before us. As we approached the Imperial Chancellery, the deafening explosion of an artillery shell instantly shattered the illusion of peace and tranquility. Piles of rubble from the collapsed wall of the building opposite were piled in front of the entrance to the Chancellery, reserved for party and government officials. I told the driver to stop in front of the entrance reserved for members of the armed forces. Several cars were already parked there. There was no sign of the usual outdoor security. One car was badly damaged. I involuntarily shrugged my shoulders. The shrill howl and rumble of a heavy shell that had exploded nearby, probably on Potsdamer Platz, once again split the ghostly silence. Behind the ruins of the buildings from which the artillery cannonade had come, rising toward the sky, the glow of distant fires flared up. A few minutes later there was another shell explosion, but this time not so close. After a long search, I finally found the guards. They kept in the shadow of the entrance. An SS soldier came up to me and asked where I was going. Then a non-commissioned officer ordered me to go to the shelter. We went down a side, dimly lit passage. Armed soldiers stood and sat along the walls, talking or smoking, and some were asleep with their heads in their laps. Muffled muttering mingled with the monotonous whirring of fans. Eventually we found ourselves in the headquarters of SS Brigadenführer Monk, who had recently commanded one of the SS divisions. Now he headed the volunteer corps Adolf Hitler, formed of volunteers, representatives of all German lands not yet occupied by Soviet or Allied troops. In all, about 2,000 men were recruited to form the last defensive ring around the Imperial Chancellery. At the moment of our arrival, Monk was loudly giving orders to a group of SS officers, accompanying his words with impressive gesticulations. Despite the incessantly running fans, the air in the nearly empty room was stifling to the point of suffocation. After checking through the adjutants that my credentials were correct, Monk instructed 2 SS men to escort me to the interior of the bunker. Here the sounds of bursting shells were barely audible. The rooms of the shelter seemed even more stark and gloomy than before. The cold grey concrete walls exuded the smell of wet cement that is characteristic of all new construction. Our path led us through a maze of rooms connected by narrow passageways or separated only by thin steel doors. All the same, scraps of conversation, whirring fans, and the annoying musty smell of wet cement. There were at least 50-60 rooms under the Imperial Chancellery. 6 exits led from this labyrinth to the surface. 3 led directly to the streets, and the rest led to the first floor of the Chancellery and to Hitler's personal hideout under the courtyard. Several rooms were stuffed to the ceiling with canned food, bread and other supplies, among which we could barely squeeze through. A number of rooms were full of armed SS men, many sitting or sleeping stretched out on the bare concrete floor, tall, sturdily built guys. One could not tell from their appearance that they were excited by the prospect of a quick fight with the enemy. Rather, they were simply resigned to their fate. Complete apathy prevailed, not only among the soldiers but also among the generals. Over the next few days this initial impression only grew stronger. At last we arrived at our destination, a small room with the same characteristic odour and crowded with staff workers of all sorts. General Krebs, together with Major von Freytag-Loringhofen, were with a report to Hitler. I began to wait, listening to the vague mutterings of the interlocutors around me, interrupted by the deafening bursts of shells of Russian artillery shelling the centre of the city. One thought was drilling my brain. How long can all this last, and what awaits us at the end? It was quite a long wait, but at last Freytag appeared, seeming even taller in the low room. Seeing me, he smiled happily. Strictly in accordance with the regulations, I reported my arrival. "Let's drop the formal tone. It is hardly appropriate here," said Freytag, extending his hand to me, and after a moment's silence he added, "We are all in the same boat now, my dear friend. Follow me and I will outline your duties. The general will be a long time anyway." We passed the cosily furnished rooms of General Bergdorf and his chief of staff. Lieutenant Colonel Weiss passed through a steel door and found ourselves in our workroom. On the left side, next to the front door, were 2 bunks. Opposite were 2 desks. A long curtain divided the room into 2 parts, with General Krebs half behind it. The walls, like everywhere else, were grey, bare concrete. After I had distributed my personal belongings in their places, von Freytag-Loringhofen familiarized me with the location of the most important sections of the asylum and described the company of people in which we fatefully found ourselves. Hitler's asylum included an office, a bedroom, 2 living rooms, and a bathroom. Adjoining his private quarters was the familiar conference room. The large room next to it served as a reception room during meetings. A small room on the lowest level of Hitler's sanctuary was for his Eastern European sheepdog Blondie and her 4 puppies. Above it, a number of small rooms, which housed the telephone exchange and power generator. Here lived Hitler's personal physician, Dr. Stampfegger, 2 rooms. Goebbels, 2 rooms. Guards and servants of the Führer. On the top level, Goebbels' wife and 5 children lived in 5 rooms. There were also a kitchen, in which Mademoiselle Manzieli prepared vegetarian dishes for Hitler, a dining room, rooms for servants, orderlies, guards. Hitler's underground structures were connected to the outside world by a ventilation shaft, a staircase leading to the inner courtyard, and a passage to the shelter under the Imperial Chancellery, located much higher than the Führer's bunker. At the end of the passage was the press center, headed by Heinz Lorenz. Bormann and his secretaries and personal advisor, Standartenführer Zander, also lived here, and next to him placed General Fegelein, Colonel Klaus von Bülow, Admiral Voss, Ambassador Hevel. Hitler's military advisor Major Meyer, the Führer's first pilot Bayer and co-pilot Beetz, a representative of the Ministry of Propaganda Dr. Naumann. Brigadenführer Albrecht shared a room with his half-brother Standartenführer Zander. In this complex under the Imperial Chancellery were also housed several of Hitler's private secretaries and some members of the intelligence services. A little aside, representatives of Army military intelligence, General Bergdorf with Lieutenant Colonel Weiss and we, that is I, von Freytag-Loringhofen and General Krebs. Together with guards, orderlies, freelancers, kitchen staff and other service personnel, between 600 and 700 men had taken refuge in the shelter. In addition, S formations were stationed in the basement of the Imperial Chancellery. Ambassador Huvel was the permanent plenipotentiary representative of the Foreign Ministry in the Führer's headquarters. He was a good-natured fat man of moderate talents, wholly devoted to Hitler, and was under his full influence. As a career diplomat, he lived for a long time on the island of Java until Hitler, coming to power, did not transfer him to Germany. The Führer was not very sorry for his professional diplomats, ambassadors and envoys, rarely met with them, considering them all infected with defeatist sentiments and looking at things through foreign glasses. He simply brushed aside any caveats, if he read their reports and memoranda at all. Typical was his attitude toward the honored diplomat Count Friedrich Weiner von Schulenburg, who headed the German embassy in Moscow. In his memos, Schulenburg repeatedly warned against war with the Soviet Union, and even on April 25, 1941, he achieved a personal meeting with the Führer to once again try to dissuade him from attacking the USSR in vain. And after the assassination attempt on Hitler on July 20, 1944, Schulenburg was executed, although there was no evidence of his involvement in the conspiracy. Admiral Voss was the representative of Grand Admiral Dönitz. He succeeded Admiral von Puttkamer, who had held this post from 1934 until he left for Berchtesgaden. Major Meyer was the successor to Army Adjutant Borgmann, who had been appointed division commander and killed by machine gun fire from an airplane on his way to his new duty station. It was my duty to monitor the military situation in and around Berlin and Potsdam and to report hourly on the results. Bernd von Freytag-Loringhofen was in charge of all other theatres of war where German soldiers were fighting, to bring me up to speed. He told me about the development of the situation on the fronts in the last 24 hours. South of Berlin, the Russians were advancing from Jüterbog to Wittenberg. The advance units of the Red Army, which had been on the previous day on the line of Treuenbrützen-Belitz-Teltow, had advanced to a point south of Potsdam and southeast of Brandenburg. The main forces of the German Ninth Army were still concentrated in the square between the towns of Luben, Guben, Frankfurt am Oder, and Fürstenwalde. Fighting took place at the Teltow Canal south of Berlin and in the eastern and northeastern suburbs. At Prenzlauer Allee, an advanced Russian detachment was encircled. At Havel, we still held our positions, but how long could it last? On this day, Hitler removed General Riemann from his post as Commandant of Berlin, replacing him with 27-year-old Lieutenant Colonel Berenfenger, previously awarded the Knight's Iron Cross with oak leaves and swords. Hitler and especially Goebbels found General Riemann insufficiently stern and unwavering in the situation created by Riemann's efforts. The three defensive lines of Greater Berlin, the outer barrier zone, the outer defensive bypass and the inner defensive bypass of 120 kilometers, had already lost their military significance. On these borders, the inhabitants of Berlin had dug deep trenches and erected anti-tank barriers even before April 16. However, they became a serious obstacle for the Red Army. The only road linking the capital of the Third Reich with the outside world led to the northwest through Norway. It was assumed that the next day, April 24, the ring around Berlin will be completely closed. General Wenck's 12th Army was in the process of redeployment from the Western Front, where it was fighting the Americans, to the Eastern Front, where it was to face Russian troops. Its northern flank on the Rathenauple section was covered by the considerably weakened 12th Panzer Corps under General Holst. On the southern flank west of the Wittenberg-Belzig line, the 20th Corps under General Kocher, which had 3 of the most capable infantry divisions, was successfully operating. However, in general, this exsanguinated army, which felt a severe shortage of transport, tanks, artillery pieces, means of communication, could not be considered a combat unit in the traditional sense, but united with the surviving units of the Ninth Army in the area of Frankfurt am Oder, it, according to the plan of the leaders of the Third Reich, it was to recover Berlin from the Army blockade. For the defence of the city itself, the military command had at its disposal the remnants of the 56th Tank Corps, which had fought its way to the front on the Oder, led by General Weidling from the front on the Oder, returned from the same rather shabby divisions of anti-aircraft guns and militia units Volkssturmistov. Poorly trained, primitively armed and hardly suitable for serious combat operations. Down the entire 120-kilometre front, girdling Berlin, there was almost no artillery, and for a small number of guns lacked shells. It was planned to replenish the thinning ranks of soldiers with young members of the Hitler Youth. In addition, there were still at least 2 million civilians in the city. 2 divisions stood in Potsdam. To command them on this day was appointed General Reymann. The defenders of Berlin had 40 or 50 tanks. At the same time, for the storming of Berlin, the Soviet command allocated 4 armies, several thousand tanks and armoured personnel carriers. In your opinion, how long will the battle last here? I asked Bernd. 8, at most 10 days, he replied. And what can we expect from Wenck's army? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. With its numbers and logistics, this army cannot significantly affect the balance of forces and the course of hostilities. So, in your opinion, there is absolutely no hope. There's nothing at all, except a prolonged battle for Berlin for a few more days, Byrne said, and added bitterly. Maybe there would have been some hope if it had not been for Hitler. You see, he still dreams of the offensive, still has not given up his plan to attack the enemy and restore German positions on the Oder. And although the Führer had already once publicly admitted that the war was lost, he, apparently, was still as if unable to fully realize how the situation outside the underground bunker is actually developing. After his return to Berlin in January 1945, Hitler never once left the Imperial Chancellery. It would have taken only a few hours to grasp the true state of affairs, to see everything with his own eyes. But that was exactly what he did not want. Hitler was afraid to destroy his illusory fantasy world, in contact with the real reality. On those rare occasions when someone dared to tell him the truth, contrary to his fantasies, the Führer immediately lost his temper. Meanwhile, outside was in full swing process of disintegration of the German armed forces. Disintegrated the very foundations of the German state. But Hitler did not want to believe it. He still dreamed of the offensive and ordered to hang any soldier, and Volks arbitrarily left the position or lost faith in victory and expressing defeatist sentiments. And on that morning the Berliners, still living and fighting in the city and on its outskirts, were again bombarded with a torrent of false optimistic propaganda in the form of posters, leaflets and radio messages, a figment of Bormann's and Goebbels' wild imagination. It is difficult to imagine. But, as it seems, Hitler, after the seizure that happened to him the day before, again gathered his courage and even cheered up. And although it is hard to believe, but the fact remains that, obsessed with the delusional idea of the upcoming victorious breakthrough of Generals Steiner, Holste, Wenck, Schorner and Busse, he without any regret doomed to total destruction of Berlin and its population. It may be that the solemn promises of Keitel and Jodl had inspired him with utterly unfounded hopes, or it may have been the fear and madness of the man in view of his own inexorably approaching death. In the morning, the so-called flying military courts were established, vested with unlimited power in violation of all existing laws and composed of members of the Berlin branches of the Gestapo, security service, military and criminal police. They were almost without exception Nazi fanatics, obedient tools in the hands of Goebbels and Bormann. They hanged people indiscriminately, pinning placards accusing their victims of cowardice or treason to their chests. Hundreds of soldiers, officers and generals, many decorated for courage and bravery, were strung from lampposts and roadside trees simply because they were convinced of the futility of further slaughter and destruction and wanted no part of it. Sometimes just a momentary lapse of consciousness, or some common misunderstanding that could not be immediately cleared up ended in a literal lynching. Having somehow adapted to the environment, I began to work. It was necessary to prepare staff maps for the morning meeting with Hitler. The work was complicated by the fact that for the last 3 days 3 military commandants of Berlin were replaced, and each time the change was accompanied by a complete reorganization of the chain of command from top to bottom. After the removal, on Goebbels' initiative, of General Riemann, Goebbels' man, the fanatical Nazi Lieutenant Colonel Kater was appointed to the post, and after his injury, Lieutenant Colonel Behrenfenger. In the end, I found my own solution to the problem arising from the commandant's quagmire. I began bypassing the chief commandant of the capital to receive information by telephone directly from the commandants of the 8 sectors of the city's defense, into which Berlin was divided. The day had not yet ended when I happened to witness an entertaining performance of the Theatre of the Absurd played out in the Imperial Chancellery. As I was told, just after noon a message from Goering was broadcast over the radio. In it, referring to the information received that the course of hostilities would not allow Hitler to fully perform the duties of the head of state, he declared his intention to assume the functions of leader of the Third Reich and commander-in-chief of the armed forces in accordance with the provisions of the law of June 29, 1941. The message went on to say, if he, Goering, until 10 o'clock on April 23rd does not receive a substantive reply from Hitler, he will assume that the Führer approves of his initiative. To ensure that the message did not fall into the hands of Bormann before it is seen by Hitler, Goering sent identical messages to his representative in the Imperial Chancellery, Colonel Bullow and Field Marshal General Keitel. But what happened was exactly what Goering most feared and what he tried to prevent. The first to read the message was just Bormann, and without wasting time delivered it to Hitler, of course, with comments reduced to the fact that, say, Goering's ultimatum, this is an obvious treason. Meanwhile, the message did not look like an ultimatum, and in tone rather resembled an ordinary request, and literally dotted with all sorts of assurances of loyalty to Hitler. And yet Bormann was able to convince Hitler in the insidious plans of Goering. As a result of Bormann's intrigue that same evening, Hitler, by his order, transmitted by radio, removed Goering from all posts and positions, excluded from the ranks of the Nazi Party and deprived of the title of Reichsmarschall. In addition, at Bormann's suggestion, the SS organs were instructed to immediately arrest and imprison Goering. Hitler's hysteria, caused by Goering's message, and the diabolical machinations of Bormann witnessed with his own eyes reach Minister Speer, as well as Keitel and Jodl, who appeared in the Imperial Chancellery to report on the results of inspection trips to combat zones. As Commander-in-Chief of the German Air Force, instead of Goering, General Bergdorf recommended the appointment of Colonel General Ritter von Greim, commander of the 6th Air Fleet with headquarters in Munich. Von Greim was not informed of the decision, but only ordered to report to the Imperial Chancellery. I finished my work about 2 o'clock in the morning. The sector commandants reported a slight decrease in the intensity of the fighting by evening and an almost universal lull by nightfall. Early in the morning, about 5:30, I was awakened by the deafening bursts of artillery shells, 5 or 6 of which fell quite close to the Chancellery, and at 6:00 the Russians resumed their regular shelling of Hitler's headquarters. The bursts followed one after another at intervals of 3 minutes, just as the day before. No sooner had I finished my morning toilet than Hitler's personal adjutant S. Guntius, sent by the Führer to get the latest information about the situation at the fronts, appeared. When he left, I telephoned all the communications officers of the General Staff in the Berlin defense sectors and in Potsdam. At a much from each hour, at dawn, after an hour-long artillery preparation, the Russians everywhere went on the offensive. A few hours later came the news. Soviet troops were about to cut the last main highway linking Berlin with the rest of Germany. Russian tanks appeared in the wooded area between Doberitz and Dalgov, which meant that Berlin was practically in the enemy's ring. The underground telephone cable was now the only means of communication with the outside world. This line functioned properly until the morning of April 28. Through it, Major von Frittedi established contact with the Wehrmacht Supreme Command. April 23 moved to Fürstenberg, 60-70 kilometers northwest of Berlin, receiving information about the situation in South and North Germany, in Bohemia, Courland and the mouth of the Vistula. I and Bernd von Freytag informed General Krebs, and then the three of us about 10.0 went to Hitler's bunker. The straight road was cluttered with piles of debris, broken bricks and concrete structures, and we had to take detours to get to a long underground corridor under the courtyard of the Imperial Chancellery. The concrete ceiling had been pierced in several places by shells and bombs, and water stood ankle-deep in the dark, poorly lit passageway. We walked, carefully balancing on planks, past the kitchen utility room and 2 mess halls, and then descended into the Führer's hideout. The journey underground took a little over 5 minutes, and during that time we were checked 6 times by guards standing 2 and 3 at a time, armed with automatic rifles and hand grenades. In both canteens, S-officers and non-commissioned officers sat at long tables, drinking brandy and real, not surrogate coffee and eating sandwiches spread on large platters. We army officers, they barely dignified with a careless nod. In the reception room of Hitler's office we were received by Gunshi, who asked us to wait a few minutes. The Führer, they say, finishing breakfast. In the passage immediately adjacent to the reception area, there were 5 heavily armed SS officers from Hitler's personal guard. I involuntarily recalled yesterday's visit to Vossstrasse, when we could not find a single guard for a long time. So where was the enemy more feared after all? On the streets of Berlin or here in the underground? One could see that someone had tried to smooth out the overall gloomy impression of the room. On the right, just above the long bench, 6 paintings by old Italian masters hung on the wall. Against the opposite wall stood a table and 4 pseudo-rustic chairs. Next to it a door to the deliberation room, and to the left a door to Hitler's apartment. Soon the left door opened and the Führer appeared on the threshold, followed immediately by a limping Goebbels and then Bormann. After shaking hands with Krebs and us, Hitler went into his office. He slouched even more, shuffled his feet even more. His eyes did not burn with that strange fire that I noticed at the first meeting. His features sagged, and he looked sick and very decrepit old man. Krebs stood at one end of the table, to the left of Hitler's chair. Goebbels took a seat opposite. This short, stubby little man had also visibly deteriorated. The expression of his pale face with sunken cheeks betrayed extreme anxiety. Listening to reports, Goebbels constantly checked our statements with the staff map lying on the table and sometimes asked questions. His concerned face and anxious look, once fanatically burning eyes, were more eloquent than any words. As Berlin's High Commissioner of Defense, neither he nor his family could leave the city. Goebbels had essentially become a hostage to his own propaganda. Others, at least, were able to keep their families safe. He had no such option. His wife and 5 children were to share his sad fate. I had to leave for a short time, to take a telephone call. When I returned, Hitler was still talking with Krebs and Goebbels, coming up to me, whispered inquiries about the latest news. Apparently, he did not expect to hear something encouraging or comforting. In response, I whispered that the tank columns of the Russians, advancing from the bridgehead in the Harz, advanced 50 kilometers to the west and reached a point south of Stettin, where we have a very weak line of defense. As soon as Krebs finished reporting, Hitler looked at me questioningly. For a moment I hesitated. I would have been preferable to first outline the situation Krebs, but the general impatiently moved his hand, and I had no choice but to report to the Führer, so to speak, impromptu, without prior careful preparation. All the time I was prevented from properly concentrating, shaking left side of the body and head hit. Whenever he began to drive a trembling hand on the map, I was afraid to lose the thread of my reasoning. When I finished, the Fuhrer was silent for a while, as if thinking, then suddenly turned to Krebs, began to shower him with profanity. At the same time he moved forward with his whole body. His hands convulsively gripped the armrests of the chair. The success of the Russians in the strip of the 3rd Panzer Army, occupying the defence along such a favourable natural barrier, which is the Oder, can only be explained by the incompetence of the German military leadership. Nitter shouted, poking his hand at the map, lying in front of him. Krebs tried to cautiously object, recalling that on this section of the front we had only hastily formed units and detachments Volkssturm, while Marshal Rokossovsky threw in the attack selected guard divisions. Krebs also recalled the minor reserves of the 3rd Panzer Army had been used earlier on both flanks, where the threatening situation was developing, and partially transferred to the defence of Berlin. But Hitler irritably brushed aside these arguments. The offensive north of Oranienburg, he said, must necessarily begin tomorrow at the latest. For this purpose, the Third Army must gather in a fist all available forces, removing from other parts of the front where the enemy is not yet active any military units. It is necessary at all costs to restore direct communication between Berlin and the northern German lands. Immediately transmit my order to the troops. When Bernd von Freytag-Loringhofen left the office for a moment to forward the Führer's order to the necessary authorities, General Bergdorf, who joined us in the meeting, mentioned SSD General Steiner, who was preparing an offensive from Oranienburg. Until recently, Steiner had commanded the elite 3rd SS Panzer Corps in Courland and had enjoyed the special patronage of the SS paramilitary leadership and the Führer himself. But now Steiner's name caused Hitler another uncontrollable fit of rage. These puffed-up, shallow and indecisive leaders of the SSI do not need. He raged. I do not want Steiner to command here under no circumstances. And Hitler immediately ordered to remove Steiner from the leadership of the operation, and that ended the meeting. At noon came a report of increased Soviet pressure on the city from the south. Not an hour later, we were notified that Russian artillery had begun shelling the Tempelhof airport area and the runway was rendered unusable. From then on, the city could only be supplied by air from the Gatow airfield. However, at 17.0, we learned that this airfield too was under intense enemy artillery fire. Soviet infantry appeared in the wooded area north of Dobritz with 3 T-34 tanks, blocking the Berlin-Neuen highway, the last main road from the capital to the west. From noon onward, as a last resort, a runway in the center of Berlin, on the avenue on either side of the Victory Column, was being hastily prepared. Toward evening, the shelling of the central quarters of the city increased markedly. Until then it seemed that the fire was conducted by only one battery for the purpose of psychological influence, but now the shells were falling almost continuously. The Russians, as it seems, pulled up significant firepower of large caliber. Late in the evening, from the headquarters of Army Group Vistula, we were informed of heavy defensive fighting, which is the 9th Army on the line Luben-Guben, Frankfurt, Fürstenwalde. Therefore, it could not, according to the order, regroup to attack in a westerly direction and join up with Wenck's army. Advanced units of the Russians at this time had already entered the area south of Potsdam and southeast of Brandenburg. As reported from the headquarters of the 12th Army, they have not yet managed to build a solid line of defense or create a strike fist of combat-ready compounds to break through the blockade of Berlin from the outside. More, the troops of the 12th Corps divided into independent groups and fought with the advancing enemy. On the night of April 24, Hitler issued an order to disband the Supreme Command of the Army and transfer its functions to the Supreme Command of the German Armed Forces, and to merge the Army General Staff with the Wehrmacht headquarters under the overall leadership of General Jodl, who finally realized his long-held dream, although too late. On the evening of April 24, information was received, not yet confirmed from other sources, about the meeting near Ketzin, 15 kilometers northwest of Potsdam, of Marshal Konev's advanced units, advancing on Berlin from the south, with the same units of Marshal Zhukov breaking through to the capital of the Third Reich from the north. By midnight on April 24, there were the first signs that resistance on our side had increased markedly. The draconian measures of the courts-martial and the ruthless total mobilization of all civilians capable of bearing arms, which had been carried out by Goebbels and Bormann during the previous day. The previously expressed assumption that the Russians have pulled up a significant amount of artillery was fully confirmed on April 25, when the enemy at exactly 5:30 opened a hurricane fire on the central quarters of Berlin. The shelling continued for about an hour, and then it again took the familiar form of psychological pressure. Around 10:30 we were ordered to report to Hitler. In the reception room we found Bormann and Lorenz, the permanent representative of the press ministry in the Führer's headquarters, already waiting. After brief mutual greetings, we proceeded to Hitler's office. No sooner had Krebs begun to report, as Lorenz interrupted him and asked permission to inform the audience about the latest developments. Using the radio equipment of the Ministry of Propaganda, Lorenz listened to the early morning news transmitted by radio stations in neutral countries. In particular, they spoke about the meeting on the Elbe. Near Torgau, the Americans and Russians, and the disagreement between the commanders of American and Soviet units on the delineation of the zones of occupation. The Russians, they said, complained that in this matter the Americans did not honor the agreements reached earlier at the Yalta Conference. His eyes seemed to be encouraged by this message. His eyes flashed with the same fire, and he straightened up sharply in his chair. "Gentlemen," he said with pathos, "we have before us irrefutable evidence of serious contradictions in the camp of our enemies. Would not the German people and our descendants brand me a criminal if I were to make peace today, when there is a real possibility that our enemies would fight tomorrow? Is it possible that at any day or hour a war will break out between the Anglo-Saxons and the Bolsheviks over Germany, which they already regard as their prey?" I remembered this statement of Hitler when later, after the war, I talked to an officer who took part in the negotiations on unconditional surrender, which took place in Reims on May 6, 1945. As he told me, the German delegation arrived at the place at the agreed time, but the negotiations did not begin. They were waiting for Dwight Eisenhower, who was late. Entering, Eisenhower went to Jodl, and after a short mutual formal introduction, "Why did you continue to fight even after the defeat at Avranches? After all, at least at that point you should have realized that the victory in the war will be for us." And Jodl replied, "Hitler and I were of the opinion that our adversaries are bound to quarrel over the future division of Germany and because of ideological contradictions." Finished talking and consoling himself with unfulfilled hopes, Hitler again turned to Krebs. In the course of our report, he several times inquired about the whereabouts of General Wenck's army and the results of breaking the blockade of Berlin from the north by the Third Army in accordance with the previously issued order. But we had nothing new on both questions. It was on this day that our formerly regular telephone communication with the outside world began to break down. Nor did we have radio communication, and for several hours we received no information at all from the fronts outside Berlin. From hour to hour, the intensity of artillery fire from the enemy increased. At noon, powerful shells began to fall directly on the building of the Imperial Chancellery. The ventilation had to be shut off for a quarter of an hour, which otherwise drew lime dust, smoke, and the acrid odor of sulfur into the shelter instead of fresh air. In the afternoon and throughout the evening, there was a steady stream of alarming reports of the deteriorating situation everywhere. At noon, the headquarters of the Supreme Command of the Wehrmacht reported the breakthrough of the front on the Oder. Large tank formations of Marshal Rokossovsky broke a wide gap in our defensive positions and rushed westward in the direction of New Strelitz and New Brandenburg. According to the information received, The attempt to break through to Berlin from the side north of Oranienburg ended in failure. As we remember, the operation was carried out by direct order of Hitler. Although our troops managed to go 2 kilometers deeper and to win a small bridgehead south of the Rapin Canal, they could not advance further because of huge losses in manpower and equipment and because of the superior forces of the enemy. The 12th Army reported fierce enemy attacks on the Wittenberg-Treuenbrietzen line. Even in the early morning, Army Command reported the successful concentration of 3 divisions of the 12th Corps, led by General Koehler in the area southwest of the line Nimischkork. Belzig, but their involvement in the shortest possible time, was severely hampered by incessant enemy attacks. The leadership of the 12th Army still hoped that it could use these 3 divisions to strike in the direction of Jellica and Trebina and then reunite with the 9th Army. Red Army units continued to advance toward the west, and we in Berlin unwittingly found ourselves deeper and deeper behind Soviet lines. The mood of many in the bunker fell to zero, when at 18.0 it became known that the advanced detachments of the Russians penetrated into the southern outskirts of the city and reached the neighborhoods of Sellendorf and Neukölln. Fighting was also going on south of Dahlem in the vicinity of the Tell Canal. A reconnaissance group of Russians on armored personnel carriers appeared, though only briefly, at the airfield in Gatow. About 2,000 students of the nearby Air Defense School were huddled in trenches on the territory of this educational institution. Meanwhile, the airfield in Gatow was already completely unsuitable for practical use. Hitler ordered to organize the supply of Berlin with everything necessary by air, dropping at night loads on parachutes. At about 19.0, we were again invited to the Führer for an interim report on the situation at the fronts. When we arrived in Hitler's office, he was in a state of deep depression. Even the fact that Steiner did not fulfill the order to attack from the bridgehead north of Oranienburg, against expectations, did not cause him the usual emotional explosion. Hitler only tiredly remarked, "I told you, Steiner will certainly fail the operation." Since the Russian attack on Spandau posed a serious threat to the western defences of Berlin, the Imperial Youth leader of the NSDAP, Arthur Axmann, was ordered to send as many members of the Hitler Youth as possible to the threatened area. It was necessary to hold the bridges over the Havel at Pickelsberg at all costs. That was their main task in the overall battle for Berlin. In recent days, Axmann had left his usual official residence at Adolf Hitler Platz and deployed his command post at Wilhelmplatz, close to the Imperial Chancellery. He appeared daily at the refuge to report on the situation or to learn the latest news about the situation on the fronts. At other times, he was almost always on the front lines with members of his organization, who were continually being sent in droves to die for a lost cause. News of our sharply deteriorating situation spread quickly among the occupants of the bunker beneath the Imperial Chancellery. The SS officers and Hitler's personal guards, who had previously ignored or treated us with arrogant condescension, suddenly turned into the very courtesies. Major Freitag and I had difficulty avoiding direct answers to the many questions that came at us from everywhere in the vast shelter. These arrogant, snooty SS men, who had previously despised us army officers, now sought comfort from us, ingratiated themselves with us. Most of them had never been to the front and had never come face to face with death. Some had stunned themselves with alcohol out of fear of the inevitable end. Forced passivity, the constant bursting of shells overhead. All this got on the nerves, depressed and pressed on the psyche. Many of them that evening for the first time truly realized that the Führer's shelter could be their common grave. And yet it had not even occurred to any of these people to volunteer for the defense of Berlin. Late in the afternoon, I called all 8 sectors of the capital's defense and inquired about the morale of our troops, which was not usually mentioned in the daily reports. The picture was the same everywhere. Many Volkssturmists of elderly age, poorly armed, inadequately trained and supplied, with the approach of even a small enemy force, tried to leave their positions and join their wives and children who had taken refuge in the cellars of their apartment houses. The majority showed up at the assembly points only out of fear of the military field courts, the SS and the military police. The few regular units held firm, but there was a catastrophic shortage of ammunition. In the ranks of the defenders of Berlin were still few soldiers with combat experience. Points of stubborn resistance, the Russians, as a rule, bypassed from the rear. In all sectors it was difficult to cope with the raging fires. There was no water for extinguishing, and the fire turned whole streets and neighborhoods into ashes, stopping only in front of the ruins of houses destroyed by bombs, where there was nothing to burn. The Red Army had a multiple superiority in manpower and equipment, especially in tanks and artillery pieces. It was reported from a southern sector that the Russians were being helped to navigate the city by former German prisoners of war, members of the so-called National Committee established in the Soviet Union. I reported all this to General Krebs. It was quite late when Major Bernd von Frettig-Loringhofen and I went upstairs and left the shelter to get some fresh air. The noise of the gigantic battle had almost subsided, only occasionally broken by the sound of the bursting of single shells. We could see the glow of numerous fires, but the night air was clean and cool, and we enjoyed breathing it in after a long stay in the dungeon. High above the ruins of the city was a star-spangled, magnificent night sky. For a long time we stood in silence, gazing into the distant glow. "Hey, in a few days it will all be over," Bernd finally said quietly. "I don't want to die with those people down there. When the end comes, I want to be alive and free." And he was silent again, but what he said was deeply felt by both of us. At midnight we returned to the bunker. There was still much work to be done. The next morning, April 26, at 8 o'clock, we were informed from several sectors of the drop at dawn from aircraft Messerschmitted 109, in the center of Berlin, several hundred bales of supplies. Unfortunately, it was possible to find among the ruins of houses only 1/5 of the cargo. As for ammunition, this was but a drop in the ocean of actual needs. The few tank and artillery units of the 56th Tank Corps, which otherwise could not be properly utilized, were in particular need of shells. So we sent a radiogram to the Wehrmacht High Command with a request to send 2 airplanes with ammunition to Berlin, which should, despite the considerable risk, try to land on the main avenue, near the Victory Column. The lampposts and trees on both sides of the avenue had been removed in advance to create a more or less suitable landing site. At 9:30, we were notified by radio that 2 Junkers 52-2 transport planes with shells for the tanks had already left for us. In order to avoid confusion and erroneous actions, I immediately notified the appropriate authority. At the same time, we instructed the management of the military hospital to prepare 50 seriously wounded for evacuation within 2 hours. At 10:30, both airplanes landed safely near the Victory Column. Our jubilation could not be described. We were used to rely only on ourselves, on our internal resources, and here we had a tangible connection with the outside world. By 11:00, both airplanes were loaded with severely wounded and prepared to take off. Everything was done in a feverish hurry. There was no need to expose the planes to the danger of artillery fire for longer than necessary. The first airplane took off without any complications. However, the second plane hit the wall of a nearby half-destroyed house with its left wing and crashed immediately after takeoff. Later, I learned that not all the passengers of this plane were killed. It had not yet had time to gain altitude and speed. At 8 a.m., after an artillery preparation, the Russians attacked our positions in the area of Teltow Canal, in the section Teltow-Dreilinden, and quite quickly captured these points. By evening, the Berlin districts of Machnow, Niklasy, Zehlendorf, Schlachtensee, and Stieglitz were in the hands of the enemy. In Neukölln, there was fighting at the southern end of the Tempelhof airfield. The Russian attempt to develop an offensive in the Grunewalder forest area by motorized units was foiled on the narrow isthmus between Lakes Schlachtensee and Krumlank, but the German 18th and 20th motorized divisions fighting here found themselves in a most difficult position. 2 reports from the eastern and northern sectors of the capital were equally disappointing. Here, the enemy, after a short artillery preparation, also went forward. Throughout the day, there were fierce, protracted battles near the Stettin and Görlitz train stations. There was a complete loss of control over the areas of Reinickendorf and Tegel. Especially dangerous was the Russian advance to Siemensstadt, which was stopped only on the banks of the Spree, where a fierce battle broke out. Toward evening, there was information about clashes in the neighborhood of Charlottenburg. The information coming from different parts of the city became more and more contradictory and vague, and we had to create a general picture of the situation by getting data, so to speak, at first hand. We decided to use the still functioning telephone network of the capital for our purposes. It was enough to call someone we knew, living in the neighborhood or on the street, where, according to our assumptions, there was fighting, or randomly select a suitable phone number in the directory, and we already had the necessary information. The way, no words, primitive, but for our purposes quite suitable, and most importantly, reliable. Excuse me, madam, have you already got Russians? Yes, answered a frightened female voice much more often than we would like to hear. Half an hour ago, about a dozen tanks entered the intersection nearby. We have no firing, but about a quarter of an hour ago I observed a column of tanks marching in the direction of Ringstrasse. I was quite satisfied with such information. From many similar telephone conversations, a fairly complete picture of the general situation was created, more reliable than the reports of German military units.